Right. Good evening, all. Welcome to week 15. I got my maths right? Yes, week 15. This week we are going to hear from Professor Charlie Beckett, who is the Director of Policy and indeed from the Department of Media and Communication. Just check I get all of that right, and I did. And we're going to hear about the media, politics and government. Clearly we've talked a great deal about the institutions of government and parliament and policy making, but of course in any democracy there is an additional element, that is the scrutiny, the antiseptic, the sunlight provided, depending on how you look at it, by journalism and openness and exposure. We're going to hear about this week. Charlie.
Great. Thank you very much, Tony. Did you say week 15?
I think it's 15.
My God, what stamina. Has anybody actually been here for all 15?
Yeah.
It's very nice to come to talk to you because it's good to be talking to people who have perhaps a more sort of holistically political approach to an issue which I always look at from a journalistic perspective. And that's because I spent 20 years of my life as a journalist before coming to the LSE 8 years ago. And quite a bit of that was inevitably around politics. Indeed, some very specifically around politics. For example, I used to work for a programme called On the Record, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was the BBC's flagship political programme. And in fact, I had colleagues including John Rentoul from The Independent, Michael Gove, you might be familiar with. He was a reporter on the same programme. And I also did other things, like I did the BBC's 1992 election documentary, which dates me. But all these things come back. I think everyone's talking about 1992 as, in some ways, resonant with this year's election.
That's in 1974, which you probably weren't doing TV for.
I wasn't doing TV quite then, but yeah. Hadn't even voted, but I remember it well. My work is very much about journalism and political, not just about political communications. We have a course for that in our department, but the function of journalism within the idea of a healthy democracy, within a healthy society. Even if you want to be philosophical, the sort of neo-Aristotelian idea of the contribution of media to the good life, that idea. So that's how I approach it, rather than from a strictly constitutional approach, although I will be looking at that. So my expertise is especially around media change. I've seen a lot of it, obviously, in my career, but since being at the LSE in the last 8 years rather, increasingly accelerated media change and change in journalism. And whilst I'm very interested in the technical aspects of that, in the end, I'm interested in the ethical and political implications. And talking of ethics, as Tony just mentioned to me, for example, I just had a programme out on Sunday on BBC Radio 4. You can still listen to it on the iPlayer about the idea of good news versus bad news, or positive news and constructive news, which we didn't talk much in it about politics, but we could easily have used that as a paradigm because, as you'll see later on in this lecture, there's a very sort of binary approach to the role of media in relation to politics, whether it poisons the debate or whether it fosters it. And the other thing that might be of interest to you in relation to the fact that I'm Director of Policy, which is the LSE's journalism think tank, is that we've got a big conference on March the 27th where we'll have loads of journalists and indeed pollsters talking about the role of journalism in elections. And obviously there's an election coming up in this country and that's going to dominate that particular conference. You're very welcome to that. It's free and it's all good fun. And we're running it in collaboration with the government department. So that may be of interest. So today, what I'm going to be trying to get through, and there's quite a lot to get through, because I'm going to try and, I don't know how many of you are sort of familiar with media theory or media practice, but I'm going to sort of do a little bit on the basics. What's the structural role of journalism in the UK, politics, and how well does it perform? Then looking very much at the idea of things that are changing in political journalism, and finally trying to sort of think of some ideas about how that might impact on democracy in the UK. And the UK, it is very much a UK situation, but I think many of these tensions you can see being played out in political journalism in other countries. But before we sort of get into the body of it, I just want to sort of show this beautiful gift from, well, not God, a gift from Emily Thornberry, but a gift from Twitter, which for me, in one beautiful case study, sums up sort of what I'm going to be talking about today. How many people here are on Twitter? How many people think Twitter is a risible diversion from real serious life? Yeah, there's usually more than that. But you can be both, of course. You can be on Twitter and think that. So this is a Twitter story. Is everyone familiar with the story in the room? Is anybody not familiar with the Emily Thornberry Rochester tweet? Okay, good. You must live a higher, more noble life. So what happened was, well, I'll say what happened, but this is what she did. She tweeted something on her account, and it was the day of the voting in the Rochester by-election. Okay, and so she tweets this with just one line of text, image from Rochester. And that led to her leader being so angry that he gets her to resign from her shadow cabinet post, and that she has to apologise for the offence caused by the three flag picture. People should fly the England flag with pride. So, and all that happens within a few hours of the initial tweet. So what led to that? Well, firstly, it was mainly this. Again, can everyone read this stuff? Is the lighting okay? It's a retweet, so, you know, a copy of the original tweet, but with one word added, which is the word snob. Anybody, I don't know, non-British people not familiar means, you know, somebody who's class prejudiced. And it's very important who it was tweeted by, which is Guido Fawkes. It doesn't say there, but he's got, I think, hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter. He's an independent, well, he's a very right-wing, libertarian political blogger. He's been going for 10 years, and I would say he's at least as influential as just about any other political news brand in Britain in terms of Westminster politics. So he tweets that, and then the following morning, Britain's most popular, and again possibly most influential politically newspaper, then leads on here, only here for the sneers. And you can sort of unpack the thing if you want. She was clearly, she denies it, but she was clearly sneering. I mean, the Sun, for once, is not lying. She was clearly having a dig at what was an iconic image of white van man. If you're American, that's Joe the plumber, with these flags, the Union flags, flag of St George, sorry, the flag of St George, not the Union flag, the flag of St George, precisely the opposite of the Union flag, the English flag, indeed even with the West Ham emblem, which sort of adds a little subtle extra piquancy for its working class credibility. And of course this is, you know, we can go into detail, but she has basically insulted a whole bunch of people that Labour were desperate to vote with. Now, it wouldn't have worked. It was a media effect, of course, but it wouldn't have worked, of course, if it didn't play into existing class prejudices, which, even since this beautiful sketch, which I won't play because we haven't got time, but which sort of exemplifies the British, especially English class system, of course it wouldn't have worked unless it could have played into those cultural attitudes which are still so strong and so influential in politics. But it did work. And I think it sums up absolutely the interplay between a politician who is using social media, wonderfully being able to communicate directly with the voting public, but then other people on social media, independent journalist in this case, Paul Staines, who runs Guido Fawkes, obviously very partisan, and then that networking into mainstream media with the Sun newspaper, and therefore amplifying what may have been a kind of niche scandal very rapidly, and it was all over Sky News, etc., etc. I mean, there were some sort of particular circumstances. This was a by-election, you know, very important by-election. So in that sense, it may have been that the Labour Party were prepared to some would argue overreact by getting her to resign, and that Ed Miliband perhaps was overly involved and personally sort of felt the charge of a sort of metrosexual elite. He felt that particularly sensitive. You could say it was also the inevitable consequence of a very febrile network political media, that 24/7 constant, sudden Twitter storm, suddenly translating into live television, etc. And it was also important to remember this was on the polling day, and of course in Britain, media isn't allowed, or mainstream media isn't allowed to cover politics normally on an election day. And so there was a bit of a vacuum which social media was very happy to fill into. As I say, toxic combination of an anti-Labour blogger and an anti-Labour newspaper. But despite all that artificiality and specific circumstance, it was true. She had sneered, and it did resonate deeply with people's feeling that the Labour Party leadership, particularly, and more in general politicians, are out of touch, patronising to, in this case, a particularly core set of voters. So I think that one really sums up, that case study really sums up in one beautiful little nugget of not particularly important political news, the way that the interplay between news media, social media, and politics. So, it also just shows you what a horrible game it can be if you're at the centre of it as well. But let's go back a little bit and just go back to some basics about what we think the sort of structural relationship is or should be. And again, there's lots of theoretical ways of looking at this. I look at it in quite a sort of functional way, perhaps inevitably, having been a sort of practitioner. Journalism, what does it do for politics? It's difficult to imagine any kind of modern politics without mediation in general and political journalism, i.e. topical in particular. It provides information. It acts as a kind of library for democracy, simply providing the kind of facts and records and statistics that you need, not just at election time, but at any point. It also provides the function of deliberation. You know, it creates a forum or a space where the performance of politics can happen, and that includes, you know, debate, BBC Question Time, that kind of stuff. Obviously, endless analysis, commentary and opinion making and so on. It's where we go to discuss. I mean, very rarely, although it has to be said, physical debate is still incredibly popular, but you will never go back to those ideas of those sort of Gladstone public meetings with hundreds of thousands of people, who I'm sure none of them could ever hear what he was saying anyway, but they seem to enjoy it. So it happens through the media. And then finally, this idea of accountability, that political journalism provides functions like the investigation, you know, the MP's expenses. It provides a kind of audit and a voice for the citizen and a way of campaigning, including, of course, for politicians to campaign as well. And in that sense, it has a sort of pseudo-constitutional role. Edmund Burke allegedly said there were 3 estates in Parliament, but in the reporters' gallery yonder, there sits a 4th estate. This idea of the media, the news journalists, as the 4th power in the land. No one ever knows or has ever proven whether he ever said this, which I think is beautifully symbolic of most political journalism. And in many ways, what I'm arguing, Alan Rusbridger goes so far as to say that, in a sense, because of the digital social media revolution, that journalism is now a kind of 5th estate. I'm not entirely convinced by that. I think it's more the 4th estate that's been networked. And I conceive this, perhaps because of my journalistic background, as very much a sort of a battle for power. This is one of the nicest books about parliamentary journalism by the Guardian's Andrew Sparrow, who's a real parliamentary journalism geek. And he's written this beautiful history of it. And it reminds us that this idea that, that Parliament has ever been particularly open is a nonsense. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the documentary series running on BBC at the moment, Inside the House of Commons, by Michael Cockerell. And the amazing thing is it's taken so incredibly long for a simple documentary like that, which just shows you how the place works, to be allowed to be broadcast. Because
well, it wasn't broadcast until that.
No, it wasn't broadcast.
It
Highly
broadcast
edited, and it only really ever happened because the BBC's worried about its charter renewal, and the MPs knew that they'd get a kind of soft soap treatment of it, in my opinion. But anyway, so it's amazing that's happened. Of course, the actual parliamentary lobby, the idea that journalists were allowed to go into Parliament to record the proceedings was, I can't remember the exact date, I think it's early 19th century when that happens in any meaningful way. And even now is incredibly restricted. So that's why I conceive this relationship as very much a sort of battle between the press and politicians for power. And you just look through the history, you think of and a lot of this is actually very local history. It's around here, the Inns of Court that are all around us. In a sense, they were created partly because late medieval English kings needed a literate civil service who were able to tell influential political people what they were doing when they were having wars, what their fiscal state was. And so there was a kind of evolution of a kind of state PR. The famous, printing presses, the first ones in Holborn and most famously down at the end of Fleet Street. Well, of course, that press was highly licensed. There was no such thing as a free press. When the famous Habermasian coffee house public sphere was created in the 18th century, with people like Jonathan Swift running around, these were all paid hacks. The original idea of a political journalist was a journalist paid by a politician. It wasn't the idea of somebody trying to somehow represent the public or report anything factual. Reporting Parliament, as I say, a very controlled lobby under very precise rules. Broadcasting, all political broadcasting in Britain is subject to very stringent rules set by Parliament about what you can and cannot say in terms of impartiality and balance and so on. And of course, along comes another form of media, the internet and social media. And what do politicians want to do? Do they want to let it thrive and go free, or do they want to impose controls and surveillance? You know the answer. And so that kind of cynical attitude that I've just demonstrated, has led over certainly the post-war, in a sense that there is these two estates, if you like, in a kind of death struggle, grappling with each other for power. That's actually the cover from John Lloyd's book, which sums up the pessimistic case best, albeit made by a journalist. The book is actually called What is the Media Doing to Our Politics, I think. And he obviously thinks it's doing something very, very bad. And there are, at least two sides. One, the pessimistic politician side, of course, is that the problem with political journalism is that journalists are unaccountable. They're unelected. The Guardian is going to let some of its staff vote in an advisory capacity for the next editor. And that's about as far as democracy in British media goes, I think. Obviously, the BBC is accountable through the BBC Trust and so on. But journalists are unaccountable, say the politicians. They're incredibly biased. This is not unique to Britain, but we do have a quite extraordinarily partisan press. Politicians complain that journalists are only obsessed with process, with the kind of personality battles and the horse race. They say that journalists are cynical. They don't understand the great work and idealism of MPs. They say journalists lack information. They can't be bothered to turn up for debates. They only turn up for PMQs. They lack expertise. And one particular concrete material problem, they talk about, politicians complain about the lack of the local press, mainly because the local press were the only people that ever used to report what they said in a nice way. But it's a genuine loss because of the economic problems of political journalism. Journalists complain equally, actually, about the loss of resources, so that the idea that you can spend ages in select committees or actually doing any research when you're doing your political journalism, it's become much, much harder, not just because there are fewer political journalists, but that each journalist is expected to be much more efficient. They're expected to write more articles or do more, package more broadcast material. Journalists continue to complain about government secrecy, despite freedom of information legislation. Generally, it's still the default position is not to tell, not to put people in the open. And we see with processes like the Chilcot report and so on that there are still ways of keeping things out of sight. But perhaps the biggest change has been in the PR, the rise of PR. And I haven't got the figures on these slides, but for example, the incredible increase in civil servants who are working in communications, the incredible increase in SPADs who spend a lot of their time dealing with the media, and the incredible amount of money spent. We heard just recently how much the Conservative Party was spending on Facebook advertising. And generally the spend, despite legal restrictions, has increased all round. So that volume of political spin, or you might say information, has increased. And the final thing that journalists worry about, perhaps less so actually now, they got used to it, is the idea of disintermediation, which I'm going to come back to in a second. But basically, some other bugger is doing their job probably even better than they do it. So not just people like Guido Fawkes, who's effectively a professional media person, but increasingly bloggers, people on social media, who are doing, if either providing information or doing some of that commentary and analysis that journalists like to have kept to themselves. And finally, I won't go through the list, but then what do the public think the problem is? And you can see here that in many ways what the public complain about is somewhat contradictory. And I don't mean to say that somehow, the public are stupid or anything, but that they are genuinely real dilemmas. So that, the programme I did on Sunday was about, this good news, bad news. Well, is journalism too negative? Is it always stressing crises and disasters? Shouldn't it, in the political sphere, be talking more about the policy successes? Shouldn't it be talking more about solutions to problems and so on? And then, of course, if you started doing that, the public would start worrying that you weren't being sceptical enough, that you were letting politicians get away with things, that you're acting as a mouthpiece for the politicians. So then there's a genuine, problem there of balance and so on. I mean, my favourite is the boring versus sensationalist. If you try and make something exciting, everyone says that you're exaggerating and being over-dramatic. And then, of course, if you don't, they just say it's boring. So, real dilemmas there, I think, for how political journalism works. So how bad is it? I mean, how many people think that we've got a crisis? How many people think we've got a problem, at least, or a serious problem with political media in this country? Hands up if you think. And hands up how many... No, this is really silly, but let's just do a little bit of pantomime. Hands up those of you who think that, in your gut, you think the journalists are to blame, that they're not very good at their job, they're over-partisan, ignorant, etc. And just because I'm a journalist, don't worry, I'm not a journalist anymore. Very few. How many people think politicians are to blame for the state of political media? Oh, great, yeah, we're winning. I wonder if you'd say the same if a politician was standing here. Anyway, this was what the manifestation of the problem, if you like, which is that this is from 1992. That's right. When everyone thought Neil Kinnock was going to win, John Major narrowly won, and on the day, I don't know if you can see it, on the day of the polling, the Sun had that headline, will the last person, if Neil Kinnock wins, will the last person to leave the country please turn the lights out? And the Sun claimed that their campaign, not just that day, had swung the vote. not really true. I think most sophologists who have looked at this can't really pick up any significant effect related to the Sun campaign. Of course, it may have had an impact in a wider sense of framing the issues and so on. Likewise, the other way, this is where you make a joke about a small cow. I don't know why she's doing this. I don't know why.
I think it's a PR. I'm just guessing.
Yes, it is a PR. Obviously, she's not rescuing the cow.
No.
But I can't remember what the point was. You know, did you notice there's a sort of in-joke for political aficionados? Who's the person behind? Pardon? Selwyn Gummer. What did Selwyn Gummer do with a cow product?
He fed it to his daughter.
That's right. He made his daughter eat a hamburger. Beef burger, rather, during the height of the foot and mouth. Do I mean foot and mouth? No, I mean...
BSE.
BSE, yeah, the BSE crisis. Another stunt, beautiful stunt. Anyway, and, you know, Margaret is sort of widely...
Lovely church in the background.
No, actually relevant. Just
Yeah, sorry.
It's in the countryside is the main thing. She's in the countryside with a cow, the rural vote. And again, that was seen as a sort of... She especially was seen as a sort of PR triumph. But again, I sort of would doubt that in the sense that she was rather splendid in her own right, and she had a real ideological, tactical, political message. So to say it was all down to the spin, I think, is to deny recognition. But generally speaking, that idea that this battle between the spin and the press power ends up with this situation, and I think both Tony and Alistair would agree with that. Alistair's diaries say that the reason that New Labour was so intensely obsessed by media to the degree that, you know, Campbell was arguably a deputy prime minister, certainly he'd like you to think that, but had extraordinary influence and there was extraordinary control, especially early on, was very much a reaction, they argued, to this paranoia about the power, especially from a Labour Party, about the power of the right-wing press, and they never wanted to allow the Sun that kind of latitude again. And of course, how they dealt with that was partly by being friendly to them, but also by imposing incredible media discipline on their troops. And that then translates into David Cameron. One of the things that New Labour did was to cosy up, as you know, to Rupert Murdoch, and that only ended with Ed Miliband recently. And David Cameron, who copied Blair in so much in terms of media, certainly did that, as we know, with the Chipping Norton set, that they became intimate to the point of texting each other. You know, so the editor of News International is sending jokey texts to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And that's the point of the everyone know the LOL joke? That she kept... What does LOL mean? Pardon?
Laugh out loud.
Laugh out loud, exactly. It's a joke. Haha. Cameron thought it meant lots of love. So he was taking lots of LOL back to her, thinking he meant lots of love. And this all came out, of course, during Leveson's inquiry. And Leveson was very harsh on the way that, despite what I've told you, or because of what I've told you about the antagonism between the press and the politicians, and at the very top at least, they're cozying up together. And he felt they had, indeed, developed too close a relationship with the press in a way which has not been in the public interest. That was his major critique of political journalism. But interestingly, he disagrees with those of you who think there is a problem. So we can just end the lecture here, really. There is no problem, according to Lord Leveson. He says that regular political journalism is in robust good health and performing the vital public interest functions in a vigorous democracy. So there is no problem. There may not be a sort of a problem. You know, those of you from other countries may or may not admire the robust good health of British political journalism, but there may not be a sort of terminal problem. And as I've argued, I see it more as a kind of perpetual historical contestation rather than some sort of terminal endgame. But certainly there's been a lot of change. And so in this next bit of this talk, I want to look at how that change has manifested itself in political journalism, and then think about what impact that has. So, when I was in 1974 or whatever, 14, as Tony referred to, this is sort of what the news looked like to me, although I admit, when I was 14 I wasn't reading the New York Times, but if I'd been American I would have done. That you had news which was, analogue. It was broadcast one-to-many, in the sense, even with newspapers, a small bunch of people create a newspaper which a lot of other people then read. And the political journalist is what we call the gatekeeper. They're the people who decide what is the news. They then make it, they frame it, and then they publish it to you. And generally speaking, in that mass media age, you don't have much of an alternative. You don't have much choice beyond that. And I'm going to just compress this into one other slide now in terms of what's changed. It's what I call network journalism. 5-10 years ago, for doing this lecture, we might have talked about new media. Bloggers are going to replace newspapers. And of course that hasn't happened. Like with most media change or technological change, what tends to happen is it becomes additional. It hybridizes, it changes things, but it doesn't necessarily wipe out what was there before. And this is a really good example, that the idea of the live blog in a news brand newspaper. In this case, it's Andrew Sparrow back again, the man who wrote that nice book about parliamentary reporting. And he does a live politics blog for The Guardian. I won't go into too much detail, but the point is that this world is now multi-sourced, it's multi-platform, it's interactive, it's much faster, it's continuous, it's a live blog, and it's very accessible, i.e. both it's easy for you to connect to it, as long as you've got the internet, and it's also very accessible in the sense that you can participate in this. So, and think how different this is to a conventional article that he would have written 10 years ago, where he'd have gone to hear a debate, gone back to the office, written it up, published next morning in the newspaper. Here he's publishing as the event is actually happening. He's incorporating material from loads of different places. He's linked to the New Statesman there. He's published a tweet from Tom Newton-Dunn, who's actually editor of The Sun, a political editor of The Sun newspaper, and he's got a link there to something that Rachel Reeves has written, background information. And at the bottom there'll be reader comments and so on. On the right you can see where you can share this information as well. So you can see that journalism is networked. It's not just one person creating something. It's a sort of semi-collaborative effort. And it's also important to remember that it's not just the traditional media that are processing this. This is my favourite political website. Don't know if you've ever seen it, called Mumsnet. Hands up, anybody who's ever seen Mumsnet? You're grinning. Yeah. And you're not even a mum. That's very good. Mumsnet is Britain's most successful parenting web forum. It's got loads of stuff about, nappies and choosing kindergartens and stuff like that. But it also has quite a lot of stuff on politics. Some of it very personal politics. One of the favourite forums it has is called, what's it called? It's called Am I Stupid to Think This? Or something, Am I the Only Person Who Thinks This? And then you say, da-da. Anyway, it's become such an important forum that politicians are queuing up to be interviewed on this website, mainly because it gives them access to a demographic, i.e. young women with children, generally, apart from you, sir, who are very hard to reach. They tend not to look at mainstream news. And so this is a wonderful way to engage with them. But when you do that, you have to do it on their terms. They ask the questions, they set the themes, they talk to you directly. And famously, Gordon Brown, bless him, got caught out because he refused to answer the killer question of... What was the killer question that Gordon Brown refused to answer on Mumsnet? What? No. Yeah, that was a good one as well. What's your favourite biscuit? And he was so worried. You could think, oh, should I say hobnob? No, should I say shortbread? No, that's too Scottish. You know. So he's obviously, and that's a bit unfair. Apparently, it's because he had an eyesight problem. He was waiting for an aide to tell him what to say. Anyway, so it's the kind of, and we're seeing this in this election actually, where you're starting to see live online debates with young people. Can't remember what they're called now. So always remember that there's all these other fora which are doing political journalism alongside, but I'm concentrating mainly on the mainstream. And the political parties, of course, are also fully cognizant. I mentioned the Conservative Party paying for Facebook searches, Google search, Google advertising. But this was just a recent one where you remember when posters used to be put up on billboards next to motorways. Well, this was a recent Conservative poster that was designed specially for Twitter and Facebook, and that's the only place that you could have seen it. And it was, I think, quite a clever response to the idea that the SNP surge meant that an SNP-Labour coalition is very likely. And in the next version they put Sinn Féin in there as well, Jerry Adams from Sinn Féin. So this is now second nature to the political parties as well, to understand that Mumsnet, social media are absolutely where they should be doing their political communications. But of course, as we saw, when you think about the last UK election, you know, mainstream media is still incredibly important. The TV debates utterly dominated the media coverage in the campaign, at least. Didn't necessarily determine the result, because how much do campaigns do that? But the TV debates certainly dominated the media agenda, the political agenda indeed, at the last election. They probably won't do, even if they happen again, they probably won't do so much this time, because we're all a bit more used to them. Although the idea of at least 7 people being involved suddenly makes them a kind of novelty again, so perhaps they will get more attention. But it's to remind, but of course the point, even with those TV debates, the reason why they were so effective was, of course, primarily the fact that they had extraordinary high viewing figures. You know, millions of people tuning in for an hour and a half of politicians talking is quite extraordinary. But that effect was amplified. I won't go on about it today, but I could, you know, I do lectures for hours on this. Was amplified then by social media. So those of you who were around in 2010 will remember, for example, the "I agree with Nick" hashtag on Twitter, which has never been seen again. Nobody now agrees with Nick, apparently. But the TV debate, putting Nick at the centre of those three, allegedly transformed his status, and the social media campaign around it also seemed to amplify that effect. So again, remembering that it's the network combination of mainstream and social media, that you get these different brands. And when you think of the legacy traditional brands like the BBC, it's not just, of course, a broadcast brand anymore. The BBC is incredibly effective on social media as well. But then you do have so-called digital native news brands like Reddit, like Vice, and like BuzzFeed. And we're going to talk again about BuzzFeed at the end of this lecture. How many people have ever read BuzzFeed? Very good. How many people have actually read anything political, you know, overtly political on BuzzFeed? Okay. BuzzFeed have, they're the people who do all the lists. 20 things you didn't know about your girlfriend, you know, 30 things you didn't know about Justin Bieber, etc., etc. BuzzFeed have just hired Britain's best, or one of Britain's best, investigative journalists. BuzzFeed has just hired 3 or 4 of Fleet Street's finest young political reporters. BuzzFeed has just appointed a LBGT correspondent. So they are making a massive bid now for to be taken seriously as journalists. And finally, there's the social networks, which I won't address particularly, but again, I don't know how many people are on Pinterest, but increasingly important sites where information and debate go on in a relatively unmediated way. You know, with BuzzFeed, there are journalists. With YouTube, there are editors, actually. Stuff will get taken down if it's offensive and so on. But something like Pinterest, at least, Twitter is also edited, but Pinterest is up to you. So, again, it's a kind of political free-fire zone. And overall, this is a really simplified, obviously, constitutional diagram. It's cut off at the top, but I think you can see it, which for me just sums up, in very simple terms, graphic terms, and it has to be very simple graphic terms because I'm so crap at PowerPoint. That's how it used to be, that politicians could only, in effect, communicate with the public through the news media. And now this is networked, that politicians are perfectly capable of communicating directly with citizens and vice versa. And that means that the media has to think again about its role. Remember, we talked about that fourth estate role. Whether that changes or not depends on your definitional categories, but certainly this idea that media has the power of being the intermediary between the political classes and voters is changed. It's now networked. And, you know, the political people here don't care so much, but this, for the journalists, that means they have to redefine how they do their work, what it is to be a journalist. That if you're operating on a social media website, say, for example, you're on Mumsnet, you don't control that process if you're a journalist working on Mumsnet. You're in effect a curator. You're helping to organise what other people have created. And in that sense, you might be more of a partner than owning the process. You're certainly a social networker, or you may be a specialist. You know, you may be a political journalist who really does have special knowledge or special insight. And that's increasingly important, rather than just telling us what's going on. It also, and this is more of a media concern, but it redefines what we mean by news. You know, the idea of Kenneth Kendall, that slide I showed, reading out the news, and that was the package of information that you got, or that the New York Times with their, you know, their political section, you could read about what had happened in the White House yesterday, and that was it. It's now much more open. You can access the data yourself. This idea of liquid reality, that because it's 24/7, you never get to the point where you can say that was the news. It's always moving on. It's much more a relationship between the journalist and the audience than it was one of authority. If we, you know, to get your attention, journalists have to, it's a dreaded phrase, but it's true, it's now more of a conversation. There's no point just shouting out. You've got to be paying attention to what people actually find relevant and interesting. And that's increasingly made manifest through things like search engine optimization. Every Guardian journalist now has on their, not just the Guardian, but the Guardian's got the best one. Every Guardian journalist now on their iPhone has something called ORPAN. So every time that Patrick Winter from the political team publishes something, or Owen Jones publishes something, they can see instantly how many of you are clicking on it, tweeting it, resharing it, or commenting on it. And so they're very, very conscious of their relationship with the reader. And news is much more contested, I would argue, literally in the sense that people will critique journalists. You can do that especially through social media. But people are much more able to provide alternative interpretations or alternative sets of facts. And you see this increasingly with spin doctors who don't even bother ringing up the journalists when they're cross anymore. They just tweet back at them. And so that whole idea of news is being, and political news is being redefined. And I think it makes a difference. Well, I know it makes a difference. how you measure that difference is always a problem. But I think these are some of the key questions that we need to pay attention to if we're going to understand the difference in a slightly more sophisticated way than simply that binary opposition of whose fault it is, for example. I think these are the key analytical questions. And just very quickly, we'll look at a couple more in more detail. But obviously, we should be really interested in who has influence. You know, in this new world, does Rupert Murdoch have less influence than he used to have? Proportionality. Do we think there's a fair voice? You know, the fact that Stephen Fry's got 1 million followers on Twitter, and therefore if he says something about politics, he suddenly gets paid attention to. Is that fair? Is that representative? One of the big ones is verification. Perhaps less so with politics, because politics perhaps is more about opinion. The acceleration is something that everyone talks about, especially when you're talking about the wider sense of government, so not just politicians but civil servants who now feel that policy making and deliberation is happening so quickly and reaction to it is so fast that it's difficult to get any kind of meaningful reflection and consideration, and it never stops as well. So there's a sense of destabilisation as well. Happens much less than you think, but if you go back to the last general election, you know, remember the famous Gordon Brown moment of the bigoted woman, which was a kind of self-harming thing, actually. It wasn't done to him by a journalist, but it's that kind of surprise, the fact that any citizen could turn into a journalist. You know, they could record a politician or film a politician. And that makes, and of course that means, that's why it has one of those kind of paradoxical effects. The fact that politicians can be caught out by anyone, instead of being more open and more transparent, actually means they're more paranoid and less likely to talk honestly. The other famous example of that, do you remember the last American presidential with Mitt Romney and the 47% when he was filmed covertly by a barman? Then there's the sort of more qualitative debate about whether all this means we're getting a more superficial journalism because of everything happening so quickly, but more importantly because of the mega competition involved for people's attention. So the journalists have to be more grabby and sensational to get your attention, partly because you're distracted not just by other journalists, but you now have, you know, for those of you, your laptop open, you know, I'm sure you're not, but you could easily be on Candy Crush, you know, or something like that. So there's so much more competition for your attention. And this other one, fragmentation, which is this one really. Just going to quickly look at a couple of those concepts which kind of lurk behind our understanding of political communications. So one of the key things that people say is that all this new media is driving people into echo chambers. That you can personalise your media intake. You can go and follow the blogs you want or the Twitterers that you want. You can access the media, be it Fox News or MSNBC or the Mail. You can follow that much more closely and personally filtered out. And so this is actually a representation. This is slightly unfair because it's not, well, it is political. This is the representation of tweets around the Ferguson protests in the States. And it shows how they were divided. And, of course, the blue is the is left-wing liberal comments, the wrong way round if you're English. And the red is Republican supporting or right-wing conservative tweets. And as you can see from that, there's almost no interaction between the two camps. And when you map other political discourse, you often get quite a similar effect. I mean, for the general election, it's going to be so beautifully technicolor, isn't it, in Britain? It's going to have UKIP in there, and the Lib Dems, and the Scots and the Greens. Be fascinating and rather confusing. So it looks like this is complete bifurcation. Now, of course, when people are interacting, you know, it's not necessarily a good thing because they may just be swearing at each other. And this one is particularly exaggerated because there is nothing more divisive, I think, than race in America. But that's the accusation. But of course, you know, you only have to think about it for 1 second to think about how traditional media worked in the past. You know, the idea that these people on this train would get up every 5 minutes and swap their newspapers around, so they all, you know, shared different sources and got a variety of political viewpoints is nonsense. Of course they didn't. In many ways, you were even more locked in to a particular viewpoint with analogue media than you are now, with at least the opportunities of choice and serendipity that is now available. In terms of the actual research to prove this, unfortunately, it's rather too contradictory. That, generally speaking, there's evidence that people are choosing a greater variety of news sources, but you know, quite understandably, people are choosing news sources that tend to conform with their political outlooks. So it's neither becoming more restrained or less. And one of the fascinating things, of course, will be to see how this plays out and whether people can put in mechanisms and algorithms to try and create more diverse diets. Another great one is the distraction one. If you look at the average length of a TV soundbite, this is from America, you know, it's gone down from 43 seconds in 1968 down to 1988, 9 seconds. I don't know why I've such an old one. It's now around 4 or 5 seconds, the average soundbite. And likewise, you know, quotes in newspaper columns kept plummeting down. And of course, you could argue that that's a bad thing because it implies that people are paying less attention, that they are less seriously interested in hearing what politicians have got to say in any kind of degree of complexity. You could argue also, though, it's a function of the fact that politicians used to waffle appallingly and that journalists realised that it was much more efficient if you really wanted to get people to pay attention to politicians, that you had to put them into shorter packages. And I think especially with this one that whilst mainstream news has tended to condense, digital journalism at least offers the potential for much more context, much more long form, much more original unmediated data that you can access yourself. And again, the research on this is somewhat limited because, you know, it's very difficult to quantify how much attention people are paying to politics compared to the past. You can't take people back in time. But there's one bit of evidence from, this is Medium, which is, I don't know if you know about Medium, it's a sort of publishing platform. People can self-publish, and it kind of aggregates content and puts the most watched stuff up. And it's generally quite serious, long-form stuff. And what they've shown is that the optimum length that people will read for on that platform is 7 minutes, which is quite a long time if you think about it. You know, the average news item on the BBC News is about 1.5 minutes. You know, the idea that somebody will read an article for 7 minutes is actually quite long. And that's partly because Medium has found a good way to put together people interested in more long-form topics with serious, intelligent, long-form content. So again, people reinventing journalism using the new kind of digital affordances. And as I said, also using this ability to track how it works. So that probably tells you that you're better off writing a 7-8 minute piece rather than wasting your time with a 10-minute piece. So that maximising your chance to get attention for something serious. So again, you can see that either optimistic, pessimistic argument around this goes both ways. But I think there are this is sort of the last bit of it really, which is kind of, how do we think it's really changed things? I think the one big thing is that this new situation, or this networked situation, represents two challenges. The first one is to politicians. And as I've already hinted at, if you're faced with the prospect of greater transparency, it's quite likely that you'll react against it negatively. You won't necessarily embrace it. Transparency tends to lead to a loss of control. We all know the cliche, knowledge is power. Inevitably, you try and retain information, and you try and protect yourself from criticism. But they are now having to operate under that basic default idea that anything they do can be used in evidence against them, and that they are constantly under that kind of, not surveillance, but that kind of inspection and critique. And I think that is, I'll come back to this in a second, but I think that's a kind of challenge that politicians are still struggling with. But there's also a challenge to journalists, certainly to mainstream media, which again, I welcome. I think it's really important that we're seeing now that there are these other different sources of credible information. And part of it is media criticism. It's people who are prepared to provide either an alternative to mainstream media or actually to quite overtly critique it. So WikiLeaks is famous for its leaks, but it also raises implicitly the question of why didn't mainstream media hold power to account in that way. You can argue about whether you think the leaks were justified and so on. I think they were, but they certainly raised the question of why mainstream media didn't do that job in holding power to account, why it wasn't explained to us that they were lying about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. But WikiLeaks is obviously also a major challenge, or was a major challenge, to mainstream journalism in the way that it operated, in the way that it was able to use the affordances of the internet to publish material, but also to protect itself. The irony of Assange's present situation is that he's self-incarcerated in the Ecuadorian embassy, not because of any of those leaks, but because of his own personal legal problems. Similarly, those nice chaps in the scarves, the Syrian anti-Assad rebels, who were using social media and showed that, and they had to in the early stages of their campaign, because that situation was too dangerous for mainstream media to go in and report that war, and therefore the only sources we had were initially from these guys mainly putting videos up on YouTube. And that was a sort of double challenge to journalism. Firstly, that why weren't journalists reporting it, but also the idea that this is obviously incredibly partisan, partial information. How do you report a war if the only information you're getting is from the participants in that war, especially one as ideological and brutal as that one? And the final one, very quickly, anybody know this story? This is the school dinner blogger. Yeah? Anybody familiar with this? This was a girl in Scotland who was doing a blog about her school dinners, and mainly about how crap they were. So she was doing like a restaurant review, and it was very, very popular, and it was very critical of the local authorities' catering arrangements. So what do you think the local council did? What do local councils do in the face of fearless journalism like that? They shut her down. They told her to stop. The head teacher was told to tell her to stop blogging. And she had a rather media-savvy dad who tweeted this. And of course, what happens on Twitter when a blogger is shut down by a politician? there's a Twitter storm. So there's a massive Twitter storm, and within 3 or 4 hours, they had to reverse the decision. And as you all know, local councils don't make a decision, let alone reverse one, in hours. So it was quite a triumph for her to get that decision reversed. The nice bit of it was that she then used the fame that she'd got on social media to set up a fundraising scheme for African schoolchildren. And she ended up raising, I think, $200,000 online for African schoolchildren, and was allowed to resume her restaurant reviewing, as it were, as well. Now, the point about that is not that, 9-year-old Scottish schoolgirls are going to suddenly replace political journalists. But the point about that is it's kind of the unexpected, that it doesn't conform to the normal, relationship between press and power and politicians. And a media executive said to me that the most frightening person in the world, he thought, was not Julian Assange, was not the Syrian Free Army, but he said it was a 12-year-old girl. And he said it's because I don't know what she's going to do next. Snapchat, WhatsApp, Instagram, we don't know what she's going to do next. And I think that's one of the most important points to think about when you're thinking about media change and impact, is that it is unstable now. It's highly complex. And of course, complexity can be a good thing, because one person's complexity is another person's richness and choice and diversity. But it is also uncertain. And again, uncertainty, politicians hate it. Mainstream media editors tend to dislike it, funnily enough. But of course, again, uncertainty is almost a precondition, a necessary precondition for change. If you want to have change, if you want to have progress, then a bit of uncertainty isn't a bad thing. In that sense, I welcome the sort of instability in this relationship. And finally, I think that in a sense, or almost finally, in a sense, politicians and journalists or mainstream journalists have a similar problem. And that is that both mainstream political journalists and mainstream politicians are in an industry which, I think the next election in the UK is going to be absolutely gobsmattingly exciting and interesting. I think it's fascinating. And I think they may actually have a higher turnout, because I think it is going to be interesting. People think there's a lot at stake, there's a lot of interest in what's at play. But generally speaking, we share in an industry or a subject matter where people do feel extraordinary disengagement. I don't know if you've covered this in other lectures, but the sort of long-term historical reasons. People are becoming more individualistic, more educated, more sceptical, less tribal, and so they feel disengaged with politics. But I think they also feel disengaged with political communications and journalism, as it was previously done in that kind of boxing match, very internalised, process-driven, and very negative way. And so we both face the same problem about how do we get people's attention back. And there's been a lot of talk about this idea of authenticity as if that's some kind of solution. Well, if Nigel Farage is the solution, then God help us. Partly in the sense that, yes, he's a brilliant communicator, but authentic in what sense? Ed Miliband is very authentic if what you want is a North London Liberal policy wonk, So it's not just about some PR gimmick around authenticity. There's a deeper problem there about engagement. And I think it does go, much more deeply than, I hate to admit it as a media person, but it goes more deep than just the kind of political journalism that you have, or even just how you do your politics. But I think there are interesting ways. I'll leave you on a slightly, I'm not saying this is the solution, I'm just saying this is a slightly light-hearted way of thinking about, if it's going to come up, come on. Should have got it up earlier. There we go. This is BuzzFeed, and for those of you who've seen BuzzFeed, you know it, but I think, do you remember the floods we had? And I could have given you any number of other examples. And this was BuzzFeed's response by Jim Waterson, who then was a BuzzFeed news reporter. He's now BuzzFeed's political editor, I think. He's a very fine man. And this is how they covered this. Anyway, the point about BuzzFeed, and just leave you this last thought, which is that I'm a big fan in the sense that I think what they're doing is something quite interesting, which is, now this one wasn't trying to be a deep analysis of flood damage prevention or the environmental policies, but what it's doing there is it's engaging you with politics and with politicians. And it does it, there's a technical thing that it does, which is use pictures, which is quite important. But you notice it uses quite different pictures. The news, the next day, will use probably that picture, perhaps, or that one, you know, it will use that kind of picture. And what they've done is they're deconstructing the kind of media coverage. They're deconstructing the relationship, you know, between the politicians trying to do a photo opportunity and the journalists, but they've done it with humour. They've not done it in a nasty way. They've not said these. I mean, the nearest they get is Miliband's stare looks a bit shifty, but they're not being. It's not satirical. It's not like Private Eye, but they are doing it with humour, and so they're on your side. There's a journalist who is kind of sharing a slightly whimsical, mildly politically interested person's view on what these politicians are doing. And they're not saying that somehow the politicians shouldn't do these kind of things. You know, it's good for them to get out, but it does kind of expose the falsity of the thing, and you hope encourages them to be slightly less kind of statuesque and welly-driven. And BuzzFeed is very interesting. I suggest you look at it because their political coverage is as neutral or objective as the BBC. They're not partisan particularly at all. Sometimes they'll be, you know, they're fairly even-handed on how they critique politicians if they do. They generally speaking don't do those kind of. If you go on the Mirror, their social media and Twitter accounts and so on are quite naturally incredibly hostile to the Tories. Similarly. With things like Guido Fawkes, who's virulently biased against Labour people. BuzzFeed are remarkably neutral. This one was jokey, but generally speaking, very, very factual. But they've got this knack of speaking English in quite an informal way and of getting you into an issue, partly through the use of photos and so on, in a way that you can find sort of relevant, human, and even, you know, mildly witty. And I think that a lot of other political journalists could learn from that kind of approach, and a million other approaches like it, I'm sure, and indeed politicians could as well. So, in the end, I think the politicians are probably behind the journalists in terms of their adaptation to this new environment. And I think that's partly not, I don't think it's a particularly willful thing. I think one of the problems, this goes deeper into other issues you've been looking at elsewhere in this lecture series probably. You know, the amount of room for manoeuvre for politicians in terms of policy at the moment is remarkably narrow. And I think that certainly for the major parties anyway, this has inculcated a kind of cultural narrowness and restriction and lack of imagination in the way that they've dealt with the media. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So I've certainly seen mainstream journalists putting stories on BuzzFeed with graphs, the housing crisis in graphs. I think they do that as well, which is a very good way of doing a complex story in 10 graphs, for example, which is also good. Just before I open it up to questioning, can you just bring us up to date on the position of the statutory versus non-statutory regulation of the media debate, the post-Leveson debate, which still simmers away out there, does it not?
It simmers away. It's fantastic. I don't know if people followed the Leveson inquiry, but I heartily recommend that you obviously not read the whole report. No one does that. But there's some fantastic material. I think the video is still up. So if you actually want to see British journalists in, red in tooth and claw, there's some fantastic material there. It was the biggest ever investigation into a media system in human history, ever. Biggest thing ever.
Britain's very good at inquiries. I think we can agree on that.
And it's had
or not
that much effect in terms of statutory change. We do now have it IPSO up and running.
Better explain IPSO.
IPSO is the new version of the Press Complaints Council, self-regulatory, no charter, no statutory underpinning, and it's already started hearing complaints, but not even all the newspapers are part of it. And so, in a sense, we have less regulation than we did before Leveson, which I personally am not too bothered about, certainly not in the context of political reporting. What we have had is we've had some impact on journalism, a kind of chilling effect. All the tabloids are incredible. I don't know if you've noticed, you probably don't read tabloids, but they are all incredibly circumspect. And I talk to them and they swear blind. There are any number of great stories they would be publishing, but they don't feel they can. That's partly because of Leveson, and I suspect it's partly that the world has moved on.
By that you mean they're self-censoring in some. Yeah. They're not running stories today, political stories, which they would have run in the past, for fear that. Now, what's the thing that's constraining them? The threat of prosecution or
a bit of everything. They think they're going to get a harder time in the courts. They think they're going to get harder, and they don't want to spark off another, with an election coming. They don't want to spark off another round of shouldn't we be tougher on the papers. But I mean, does anyone remember the Brooks Newmark story recently? So it's not as if they're not doing those stories entirely, but I think there's less of an appetite right now. Yeah.
Okay, right. Question? Time for a couple of questions? Okay. Back there. Yeah. Keep it short, we haven't got much time tonight.
Thank you for such a good talk. I think journalists in this country have a credibility problem from the very, very beginning, because most journalists and people that own the media in this country come from just two schools, i.e. Cambridge and Oxford.
Oh, I see, right.
Oxbridge. And because of this, it automatically takes out any impartiality that can be put into the system due to the total domination that these two schools have on information access and what goes to the public. Would you like to see an end to this total domination from these two schools?
You can broaden the question out to the wider. I mean, don't not answer that question, but broaden it out perhaps to the question of underlying or invisible influences. You obviously mentioned several, but answer this question. We can broaden it out a bit.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who didn't go to those schools, I think there's an interesting cultural bias in British journalism. You're right that it's worse in political journalism, and it's got worse, bizarrely. I think the figures are that if you take mainstream media quite narrowly, the educational makeup has got worse, i.e. more public school boys, I say boys, but also girls, more Oxbridge people dominating certainly the higher levels of political journalism and journalism in general in the UK. And it's getting worse for all sorts of reasons. One is that to get a job in news media now, you have to do loads of internships and you have to live in London. And it's also becoming you have to have done an MSc or an MA in journalism. So all that biases against diversity. The route that I took from local journalism into the media is increasingly less available. So in quite a practical way, it's become harder. And I think it does matter. I don't agree that it's a sort of bias, either left or right, but I do think it creates, especially in political journalism, it creates a kind of what I would call common room approach to journalism, that it's a kind of clever intellectual game rather than something that's located in people's real experiences or in expert specialist knowledge, say of science or economics, that it's seen as a kind of lovely Enlightenment, PPE type exercise, Oxford Union debating, hence the success of PMQ still. You know, what a ludicrous ritual that is. And I think that does have a cultural impact both on, well, mainly on the politics, but also to a degree on the political journalism. You know, it's very difficult to define, and I admit I'm in a sense part of it. You know, I might suffer from that same. I'm a bloody English graduate, for God's sake. You know, so I think there's a cultural bias in the nature of the journalism. I don't think it translates into a political bias as such. It's more, it accentuates the London bubble effect. And you know, so for example, and this is, you know, where do journalists get their stories from? When I worked at the BBC, my editor used to have dinner on a Sunday night with his chums in Hampstead, and then come in the next morning and say, do you know what we ought to do? We ought to do a story on this. You know, journalists are notoriously bad at understanding what the real average wage is. Journalists think that mortgage rates going down is fantastic news because they've got big mortgages, so they distort these things. But I don't think it's a particularly left or right thing. What was your point? There was that.
Well, other influences that, I mean, without going into sort of conspiracy theory, but I mean, you know, other influences on...
Yeah, well, I think that's a good example of the kind of influence. When people say, I don't know, that Rupert Murdoch tells his journalists what to do, well, actually he does sometimes, you know, he used to ring up quite a lot, but you don't have to do that much with journalists. You know that if you work for the Daily Mail, it's a right-wing newspaper, which employs a lot of left-wing people, actually. But you know that that's, bizarrely, that you know that's what you're working for. You'd be pretty crazy if you wanted to right-wing, lots of left-wing stuff. Don't go and work for the Daily Mail. You know, go and work for the Mirror or the Guardian. And in that sense, my counter to the charge of the sort of influences point is not to deny it. I think proprietors have an influence. You know, we have a very partisan press. The BBC has an innate left-wing or liberal bias as well, culturally. It's not to deny that, but it's to talk about how much diversity is there. And there is somewhat more diversity thanks to the jolly old internet and social media. But also, you've always had this choice. You know, why, if the Guardian is such a splendid paper and left-wing views are so popular, why don't more people buy the thing? You know, it's out there, it's easily available. Well, one answer is that they do look at it online when it's free, but they don't seem to pay for it. It's quite interesting, that. And it's even disproportionate to the number of left-wing people we know are out there. The Guardian should be selling more stuff, but it doesn't. And I literally don't know the answer to that, but it's not that there isn't an alternative.
I disagree.
Hang on, let's just take another. We're going to run through, and we need to take one more. Well, is there one? Yep. Somewhere here, yeah.
Thank you.
It's all right. One down here.
So, I guess the source matters. I wondered if you could comment on the state of investigative journalism, salaried investigative journalism, whether that is suffering because of the financial crisis, whether media self-centering is compounding.
Can I add to that again, just to add from the chair? I mean, investigative journalism appears increasingly to be outsourced, unless I'm misunderstanding something, that institutions outside the BBC or conventional daily newspapers are increasingly doing investigative journalism or in partnership with or selling it back into. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, the good example is the one that's just broken this week, the big Swiss, the HSBC story, which is a huge collaborative effort by The Guardian, the BBC and a bunch of other organisations. That's partly because the story was so international that it made sense for them to collaborate. First of all, it slightly depends what you mean by investigative journalism. I think what you mean is the kind of classic, not just anti-establishment, but long-term, big stories, revelatory, that kind of stuff. I would argue in a way the bigger problem is not that, this is sort of related to the previous question, it's the little extra questions. It's people who are prepared to be a little bit more awkward on a routine basis. So it's what I call the third question, that people don't have time for the third question anymore. Just in their routine news coverage, too much of it is routine. So you ask the first question, which is what's going on, then you ask the second question, which is something like, I don't know, why are you doing that? No one asks the third question, which is, hang on a second, I've gone and done some research and found some data which seems to contradict what you're saying. What do you think about that? So that kind of routine stuff, you could argue is less done. But funny enough, as Tony's alluded to, in some ways, we're in a golden age of investigative journalism. When you think of, I mentioned WikiLeaks, and you think about Snowden, that kind of big stuff, there is still, within mainstream media, there is, funnily enough, an incentive to do it, which is that it cuts through. If all the stories are burbling around, they're all happening very quickly, how do you distinguish your brand? Well, you perhaps do what the Sunday Times did over FIFA. You have somebody like Heidi Blake, who does a long-term investigation, comes up with extraordinary revelations about corruption around the World Cup, etc. And she's the one that's just been hired by BuzzFeed. So it has been, in a sense, outsourced, and there are lots of other people. For example, if you're interested in sort of military analysis, there's a guy on Twitter, what's he called? Get his name wrong, Chris Elliott. He's called Brown Moses on Twitter, and he's not a journalist. A few years ago, he was on gardening leave from, I think, a civil service job. He started to investigate armaments and so on, and has now become a kind of military intelligence, terror, investigative analyst, And the way he works is not just the old-fashioned thing, the Watergate thing. You slip me some tapes, you whisper a few things in my ear, and I bring down the president. It's much more complex. Of course that still happens. MP's expenses was a straightforward leak. Here's a CD-ROM full of facts and figures. But increasingly it's about data, and it's about getting access to information, and you put it together in an intelligent way that contradicts narratives. But you've still got to want to do that. And I think the appetite in mainstream media, I don't know. The appetite is there for some reasons, but increasingly it'll be outsourced, as Tony says, to other organisations or other independent journalists in America, something like ProPublica, which is a very interesting model for it. What concerns me slightly about the outsourcing is that, what's their agenda? I'm not saying that mainstream media doesn't have an agenda, but do you always know what their agenda is? And that was really obvious, for example, around the Snowden thing. Glenn Greenwald and Snowden, different people with different political views, to put it mildly, but both of them with a very, very strong political agenda. I'm not suggesting that anything they leaked wasn't true. It was all true. But you immediately sort of raises that question.
Okay, afraid we're going to have to stop. Thank you again. Can you ask 121, because otherwise there are other people out there and I'll get in trouble. Thank you all very much. Thanks again, Charlie. And next week, Professor George Jones on select committees. Thank you very much.